I have about 2.5 minutes here. I'm going to ask some questions here, and I just want to get a quick litmus test while people are filtering in. I'm going to ask folks about their roles. For those who don't work in technology or things like that, feel free to hold your hand. At the very end, I'm going to say, if I haven't covered your role yet, raise your hand, and then I'm going to just point, and you can call out what your role is. So how many people in the crowd currently identify as a developer? Raise your hands. All right. That's going to make this next conversation really interesting. How many people here currently work as a product manager specifically? Okay. Project management? Testing/QA? Oh, this is going to be great. Oh, this is going to be fantastic. How many people work in sales? All right. How many people work in tech writing? Okay. How many people work in a field that I haven't mentioned yet out of the development cycle? Fantastic. Okay, question for everyone raising your hands. So same ones from the last question. How many of you are consultants? Okay, so the consultants who are raising your hand, this helps a lot. Cool. So as we're approaching this, one of the things that I'd like you all to keep in mind is the audience, and that's part of the reason why I wanted to go through and do this quick little poll, is because I wanted to know my audience. Now, I'm just going to raise hands. I'm going to point to a couple of people. I'm going to ask for you to, if you feel comfortable, raise your hands and tell me what role you currently have.
Director of Global Application Security.
Director of Global Application Security. Technical trainer.
Security architect.
Security architect. Consultant, okay. Heading product security, okay. Okay, director of security. So quick raise hands. How many people are C-suites or VP or higher? Cool, a lot of folks here. So with that in mind, 30 seconds left. I'm going to go ahead and just kick it off here, and we'll move on. Yep. Does it want to? So for today's workshop, you'll notice I have a chair. It's because I have 90 minutes of your time, and I will also want to sit down at a certain point. So please don't mind the chair on the stage. Today we're going to be talking about from threat description to completed mitigation, making your threat model useful. Now, I don't doubt that every person here has found a way to make a threat model useful. This is not exhaustive guidance. But in keeping with the mindset that this is more of an intermediate to advanced type of session, we wanted to talk about not just, hey, how do you do a threat model for the first time? That'll be a review. But what do we do to actually make this process better? So with that in mind, I'm going to go ahead and walk you through our agenda here. Because we have 90 minutes, yes, I did make breaks here. It's definitely going to be useful. I personally can't listen to myself talk for 90 minutes, and I hope that you all don't get tired of it. But with that in mind, here's what we're going to be going through. I'll do a little bit of introduction about who I am, why I hope you listen to me, whether or not you choose to. This might be a 90-minute nap for you. We're going to talk a little bit about the threat model lifecycle review, hopefully going over things that you've heard before, but looking at them in a slightly newer light. And one of the things I'm going to talk about here is the 4 pieces of a threat artifact. These 4 pieces are things you already have, but whether or not you know that you have them is a whole other question. From there, we're going to go into the actual exercise. This is going to be between 20 to 45 minutes. I have received varying pieces of feedback for how long this takes. So please, if we end up with more time, know that we will have time for free-form questions at the end. Outside of the driving useful artifacts, we're then going to talk about the now what. And really, I hope that you all are able to take what I'm about to show you and apply it directly after this. So with that in mind, what we're going to do is talk about why tickets are important. I know everyone loves hearing that, especially if you're in the agile space. We're going to talk about why audience matters, again, going back to the hand-raising session in the beginning, and then talking about socializing your results. I have, pardon me, one slide in here for reflection as well, too, which means that there's going to be a quiet time of 5 minutes at the end with some questions that I've put from the end of my presentation/workshop here. If you have paper, phone, laptop, please feel free to lean into that and write during the reflection portion. That is where I hope this workshop actually drives value for you, spending time here today out of this whole process. And then last but not least, there'll be a free-form question section. So, who's Jono? My name is Jono. It's like Bono, but with a J. You'll notice in yellow the different roles that I've had. My bottom two roles there are more operationally focused than as a DevOps Dojo coach and community technical manager. I found myself more on the development side, interacting with development teams, helping them understand CI/CD workflows, and helping them understand what it meant to move from their traditional, more waterfall style of interacting with software development, and showing the practical portions of where DevOps really is intersectional with doing what they've been doing, but doing it better. Last but not least, I'm currently a principal application security architect at Acquia, which is a fancy way of saying I try not to confine myself to any one stage of the software development lifecycle. I find that threat modeling has been valuable in my career at every single point in time. I just wish I knew that that was what I was doing when I first got into tech, and that's kind of been a theme of what we've heard here. My contact information's at the bottom, and we'll have slides at the end for more info. Who is Acquia? We are a service-disabled veterans-owned business, small business. Sorry, there's a lot of letters there. What this basically means is one of our primary customers are three-letter agencies, government agencies, highly controlled, highly regulated environments. For those who are part of application teams or product teams in the finance space, this is going to seem really familiar of like, oh, I have NIST controls. How do I actually make them useful for my developers to respond to? If you're interested in more, there'll be contact at the end. So what do I want you to get from this whole activity? Since I have you all for about 70 minutes, I'd like you to keep these 3 points in mind. First and foremost, you've heard it probably 100 times by this now. Threat modeling is for everyone. As I mentioned in our opening portion, there's a lot of different people from a lot of different roles here. I'm going to try and cover as many as I can. But if you feel like information wasn't represented for your role, please reach out because I want to know how I can make this more applicable to not just yourself, but other people who are trying to wonder, how does my role fit into threat modeling? Next, and this came out of a conversation that we had in the overflow room here, which is, if you have your threat artifact, the important thing is what you do with it. A threat artifact is made of the 4 components that are here: a description, a potential mitigation, action items, and questions. How you get there, stride, pasta, linden, attack trees, thinking up an entirely new process in the shower doesn't matter. What matters is what you do with it. And that's what I hope we're going to be working on here today. Last but not least, and this is, I think, probably the hardest part. So it's been about 5 years since I've been on a stage. I miss it. I love seeing all of your shining faces. This is part of engage and re-engage with your threat models. I'm up here speaking about threat modeling, but what we're going to talk about is all of the different ways that you can apply your threat model, the outputs of your threat model, and the things that we're going to discuss here today to really what is your implementation strategy and how can you actually get buy-in from your developers, from your heads of security, from your VPs, to really get this practice going. Give that a moment, take a breather. All right. So let's do a quick review here. We've all seen the Threat Modeling Manifesto. If you haven't, I highly recommend you check it out. Link is at the bottom. But out of it, there's the 4-question framework. Now, I know a lot of you are familiar with this. What we're going to do is we're going to edit it a little bit. We're going to apply this 4-question framework to our threat modeling process. Not the actual model, but the process. Rather than thinking, what is it we're working on, I'm going to tell you. We're working on making our threat modeling process more beneficial for every single participant and all of the downstream consumers. When we start thinking about question number 2, what can go wrong, I want you all to think of it in a very specific light, which is, what can go wrong when your threat model isn't translated to actionable work? We've seen this happen a lot of times where someone comes in with a very big report or a list of findings and they just throw it over the wall and leave it for some other team, security, application operations, whomever, to go through and try and address it. We all probably have horror stories of that happening. Some of the things that I wanted to point out that are actually missing here is that when we do threat modeling in a way that is rushed or time constrained or reactive, we end up creating gaps that create tech debt in our lives, and we may not actually be able to know it. One of the other things is work prioritization. That word trips me up all the time. Work prioritization. If we're not putting forth the effort to make our threat modeling sessions useful for the people who are participating, for the people that we're training this out to, everything can go wrong, because if their practice is imperfect, or if their practice is straight up bad in some cases, that prioritization will always be relative and inconsistent. Last but not least, if we actually don't participate in these, our threat models actually come out of date faster. It's not that they're not used, it's they're actually out of date faster because decisions aren't made relative to it. So for questions 3 and 4, the next thing is, what are we going to do about it to avoid these threat models that don't help us out? And for question 4, if you feel like this was useful at the end, you can tell me whether or not I did a good enough job, and I'll take that feedback for how I can improve this for the next time. And that's one of the things that we'll be working on. So with that in mind, let's dive right in. On the screen, you'll see 2 of the elevation of privilege card game prompts. These have been incredibly helpful in facilitating conversations with our developer teams, but there's some questions that we want to ask here for how are we making our system better. When we're talking about a threat description in our threat modeling sessions, do we understand what's actually going on in that threat based off of our role? If I'm an operations person, do I understand why a command injection for my application is going to be bad? Alternatively, if I'm in sales, and I say this with love, do I know what the impact of this type of attack can be on my value, on my bottom line, on my ROI? And what does that mean for our customers and their value? So, one of the big questions here is based on our role. This returns back to the concept that threat modeling is for everyone, all right? If there is someone who is in a threat model and they have no idea why they're there, perfect. They are your new best friend. Every single person who's there, as long as they're asking, how does this apply to my organization? What is this actually being used for? Why should I care about it? All of those things should be captured as part of your threat model. And we're going to talk about this more. As a lot of folks here are involved in training, I'm going to say something that's probably a little bit obvious. In your training sessions, as you train other people or explain the threats, you yourself are understanding the threats better. If we can empower the other participants on the threat model to take a threat description, modify it for their role, modify it for their audience, or why it's applicable to them, we ourselves understand a threat better. If your sales team says, yes, this particular workflow that you're worried about that creates a security gap is actually something that our customers have reported, and is actually a thing that 2 or 3 people on the sales side have actually not been able to close deals, does that change how you think about the threat? Because now it's not just a threat to the security of what you're doing, it's a threat to the value of your product for your customers at the end of the day. So, based off of the descriptions that we have here, do we know what can go wrong? We have some idea of what it can look like, some indicator of compromise, but we don't really necessarily know if it applies to us. And I think that's really the biggest point here, is that we like to go threat hunting, especially us who like putting on that attacker's hat. But if we're going through and trying to describe it, are we only making sense of the description for ourselves? So we go to question 3, what can we do better? We can shorten some of these descriptions, we can lengthen them, but specifically what I'd like to talk about, or we can even break it apart into more types of threats. But what I like is that we should be more specific. So here's a modified version of those elevation of privilege threat descriptions and what we're looking to do. One of the things you'll notice here is that we specifically describe the platform and the workload that is being ran during this threat. This is particularly important because as your audience participates in these, this may look different for whoever is listening. But by contextualizing it, you then provide them the ability to ask more questions and dive into this a lot deeper. So, one of the best things we can do is work to improve our threat detection. Our threat description. These are some of the tools that I've found have been helpful for interacting with teams and trying to go through and understand what is it that they actually care about. Why am I sitting in this room? Why am I participating in this? Why? Normal threat modelers have developers, sometimes some testers, sometimes some business leads. As was brought up earlier, what happens when you add operations? How does it change when someone from operations writes a threat description in their language rather than what the developer is expecting to see? The next question is, how often do your technical writers, your sales engineering, or even cross-functional products involved in your threat models? If you work for an organization that's probably larger than 50 people, and I know a fair number of us here do, you probably have an upstream dependency and a downstream dependency on the thing that you're doing. How often do you engage with these groups of people, and how well are they contextually aware of the threats that you're trying to design against or protect against, and how does it help them? Next is the importance of asking questions. I'm going to add an addendum here. Support asking and recording the questions. In an earlier conversation we had, there was the question of, hey, I have this giant report. It seems like no one ever goes through with it, never participates with it. I just have it, and then no one ever does anything with it. One of the things that's useful about documentation in particular is because if you can tie back the questions to why a threat is being discussed, why the mitigation is what it is, why the risks are accepted the way that they are accepted, it gives that context to everyone who may not necessarily participate in that. Now, one of the other things I want to put here is this piece of advice. If only 2 people understand the work, only 2 people can do the work. We've all probably been in those sessions where an architect or 2 are hashing it out from a description that they have of a threat or an implementation or something else that they want to put together. And then at the end of it, they finally get a tenuous agreement that it's going to look something like this. How many people have felt comfortable trying to implement work that someone else has scoped, especially out of that type of conversation? I've done it. I don't enjoy doing it. I hope it never happens to even my worst enemy. And with that, part of the reason for making these threat descriptions actionable, making them specific to the workload and specific to the audience, really then drives the documentation so that your questions that people who should know about the product have, bring up what you can be working on and how you can move that forward. So, with that in mind, we talked about improving threat descriptions. Let's talk about threat mitigations. So, when we were talking about the threat artifact, there's 4 components: the description, the mitigation, the action item, and the questions. It's important that we go through and document our mitigations. One of the questions is, why should someone who is participating in a pen test be part of my threat model? I've heard that quite a bit. And my favorite answer is, if you give a pen testing team a list of mitigations that you know work, that are testable, that have documentation to surround them, guess what? You just saved your pen testing team a lot of time because they're not going to go spend time looking at those things. They're not going to just take the low-hanging fruit. They'll move on to the next bit of work. And so over time, the more specific you get, the more consistently you're tying your documentation and your activities together, the more your description actually becomes useful to the work that's going to be done and the work that has been done as well too. If anyone's not been given credit for work before, you can understand why this in particular can be frustrating if people don't know that you've built mitigations for these things and that are in place and just don't exist. Sometimes, however, you find out that you don't have a mitigation. So what then? Is it all hands on deck? We have a fire, this is going to be terrible? No. One of the things we talk about in threat modeling is accepting risk. And sometimes we can accept that there is no risk of a threat actually happening because of application decisions we've made, because of previous secure design requirements that stop it from even being something fundamental to the system. My favorite example is how many people have ever worked with a customer and they want to host their own internal VCS rather than use a SaaS product? Anyone? Has that been a challenge some folks have read? I'm seeing a couple of hands. I want to bring this up because it's a really interesting way to completely negate certain threats. If you go to a SaaS provider, there is probably a security reason why they provide their software as a service. There's plenty of other reasons that drive value, but specifically security reasons. You have people who understand their applications and their workflows well enough to document it and provide that as value for their products. In a similar way, if we make these secure design decisions, we document them, and we revisit them frequently, then this is mitigated because we never made ourselves available to be attacked by that. Likewise, if in a year or 2 from now, when we're still working on a code base, hopefully not, but when we are, we're 10, that decision is also recorded. And so by having that decision that, hey, because we made this choice, because we chose the SaaS version of this product and didn't run it ourselves, we actually have mitigated that threat. Now, if we ever want to roll that decision back, now we have more things to drive that conversation. And this is one of the things that I feel is really valuable about threat models that people don't think about, is that your threat models should drive your purchasing decisions. By understanding what threats you're trading off in mitigations and by having to run your own systems, you're better equipped to understand how you're driving value for your company. Now that said, if it is a valid threat and you talk to the people in the audience and they are like, yeah, that's something that can definitely hit us, and you don't see any mitigations, that's a perfect way to work into your prioritization. Put it at the top of the list. Ask someone, is working on this well-defined feature that has people constantly committed to it, trying to keep it up to date, and constant burn worthwhile, when we can have one person spend maybe 4 to 6 hours working on another problem and create a brand new mitigation that provides a larger attack, lowers our attack surface area and provides a larger defense mechanism. So with this in mind, if you see that there aren't mitigations in place in the conversation, jump at those opportunities, record it, and if there's a reason why it isn't, document that. So we talked about description, we talked about mitigations. Now I want to jump to the last portion of the threat artifact. And these two things work in tandem all the time. It's your action items and your questions. So I want to start with questions. You'll remember a couple of slides ago I said prioritize and encourage people asking and recording questions. This is important because if there are questions by participants there in that conversation, they are probably questions that your customer has, that your operation team has, that your developer team has, and someone somewhere was finally brave enough to raise their hand and say, this is what we have to deal with. If we negate the value of asking questions, if we don't record them, and we never create action items to address them, our threat model is worthless. And I'm perfectly fine telling that to anyone who hands me a threat model. Because if you haven't addressed those questions, if they're not documented, your customer definitely has them, your operations team has them, your testing team has them. So, with that in mind, I want to tie back to one other topic, which is threat modeling is for everyone. I highly, highly encourage that any new hires be a part of your very first threat modeling session. Doesn't matter what their role is. Part of the reason is because when you have this concept of beginner's mind and you're joining a new organization, you're actually able to get over that activation energy or fear of raising your hand because you're new. No one's going to yell at the new person for asking what is a stupid question. There are no such things as stupid questions, and I encourage new people to bring that up. But what this also does is it gives a new person a role. Make them the scribe. Have them record their own questions in the document actively. It doesn't matter if they're only ever going to come back to it once every 3 months. You've given them something to do. And I think that's one of the biggest things that we find as a challenge to adoption is saying, how do we get the people who aren't the architects, who aren't the 10-year plus people who have written everything from the first line of code to participate in these things? And so asking and recording questions is one of those lowest barrier to entries that's going to drive the most amount of value and will continue to drive value when that person passes on the torch to the next new person and the next. So for today's activity, we're going to go ahead and build a threat artifact. In order to do this, I'm going to ask for a little bit of patience for this activity. Originally, this was part of a 30-minute talk. Now it's a 90-minute activity. And to get everyone's participation, I'm actually going to be using a tool called Poll Anywhere. And there's going to be some endpoints that you'll be able to hit once I start this activity up. So give me just 1 second. And cool. So on the screen right now is an example threat mitigation. I don't want you to rewrite, threat description. This comes from the Elevation of Privilege card game. It's number 7 in the information disclosure suite. And what I'd like for you all to do is either using the QR code or going to the endpoint, write a suggestion on how you think you would improve this. An example that I put here is name the endpoints. Go through and whatever else you think may be the case. I'm going to give it a minute and a half here. Sure, let me see if it does. If not, there's the poll EV one. Does that work? No, it didn't. Thank y'all. It's always the back row that's the most productive, let's be real. If anyone is not able to access it for any reason, please feel free to let me know. It's times like this where I wonder if I should just embed the Jeopardy music into my slide decks. That said, it already lives rent-free in my head, and I don't want to subjugate anyone to that. All right. So while the timer is wound down here, please feel free to avail yourself. You'll notice that there's several things already on the screen, and I think it's important for us to just touch base on them for a moment. Let me just pull up my history here. Thank you much. So we have a couple of different things on the list, and I'm going to show you why this all ends up coming into play a little bit later. We have going through and identifying who the potential attackers may be, mutual authentication, explain why this is something that's important, why it is a threat, why it's a threat specifically to your application. Detail the functionality of specific endpoints. This is something that is documentation driven, but can also be used to drive Swagger in your open API documentation. Last but not least, going through and providing more information about the attacker, not just the who, but how are they doing it, from where, the endpoints that are included in that. So we're going to move on to the next question here, which are, let's assume we have Amazon AWS EKS as our platform, and we have a workload that's running there. Now, if you don't know anything about EKS, that's totally fine. You can just throw spaghetti at the wall, and all answers are good answers here. But specifically, what are some mitigations that you can think of for that information disclosure question that we just talked about? Gonna do a small scroll so everyone can see some of the stuff that's been added so far. And also, since this is the first time I'm using this tool, I just wanted to ask, for those who are on mobile devices, are you able to see the other responses coming through? Yes. Awesome. Gotcha. Thank you. New tool. Got to pilot it. So far, the demo gods have been good to me. I'm going to knock on this podium wood and let's see if they keep being good. All right. So you can all go through and see that there's quite a few mitigations, but I'd actually like to point out one of my favorite things, which is that someone went through and asked a question. Thank you for doing that, whoever you are. As I'm using this tool more, I am actually going to challenge you all to think about new ways of your documentation. All of your responses here, I'm using as documentation. Please understand they're anonymized. I collect no identifying information. If you are running a threat model that is larger than a two-person or a two-pizza team, think about other ways of collecting these questions and responses as you're working through it. Because I guarantee you that this methodology is especially going to be useful for the people who can't, won't, or are too afraid to speak up in those situations. And especially for new people, especially for people who, when you're talking about their feature and they know it intimately but don't want to tell people that it is designed in a way that makes them look bad, this could be a very good way of bringing up these conversation points in a very blameless, iterative way. All right, so with that in mind, I'm going to move into the last part, which is probably pretty self-explanatory. What questions do you all have about this threat? We already had one asked, but I'd like to know what other ones you all have here. Because I guarantee you that if this is the only question you all ask or answer, you will all have one question for the threat itself. I'm loving seeing all of these responses. Thank you all. I appreciate it. Wow, the numbers just keep on going. All right, awesome. I'm going to start pulling up the answers on my side here. And I just want to talk through some of the questions as they're coming up. All right, so we got a lot of questions, and I may have wanted to give myself more than 10 minutes after this in order to try and go through all of them. But there was a lot, and I thank you all for participating in this. I think one of the biggest things that I would like to point out about some of the questions that you all are seeing are that they all come from your experiences. You, as individuals, have either come across this or have never experienced it and think that you can come across this. And so these questions drive not just your decision making, but the decision making of all the people who rely on you. Now with all of these questions, one of the best things that I can do to encourage you all for this on how to make your threat models better is to take them, put them into an FAQ and publish the FAQ with answers. I guarantee you that for every answer you have, you'll get another question. And at a certain point, the questions will fall off, and that's fine, it happens. But as a single exercise, I find that collecting the questions and answering them en masse after the session, or as part of the session and building that into your times, has been one of the biggest value adds, not just for new people, but for myself as an architect. Because if I make an assumption, a question will probably either validate or challenge that assumption. And as part of this, and as I mentioned earlier, questions drive your action items. Because if it's a question for someone, it's probably going to be a question for your customer at the end of it all. All right, so I'm going to go through and move on to the next slide here. Demo gods be good. All right, so we talked about questions. The very last activity was on questions. And we said that questions can go through and drive your action items. So I've just pulled a small sample. This is obviously a non-exhaustive list, but a small example of what your questions can actually drive and how you can reframe a lot of them. One, how do you know your mitigation's working? I ask this question for every single threat. You want to know my the answer I get the most often? Emojis on camera, off camera. It's the same one all the time. We don't. We think it's running. We have a thing that runs and occasionally puts something to our Slack output. But is it actually doing anything for us? Is it driving value for us? Is it actually protecting us better from the threat? Or is it just something that's reactive? If we're asking these questions, what's the tangible work that we're driving out of them? Well, we have test cases, we have regression tests, we have CI/CD pipelining. We can inform purchasing decisions of tooling. We can inform other sorts of logs and errors. And believe me, if you've ever had to trouble Envoy logs, you want good logs and errors writing somewhere that you can understand them. Another question that I tend to get often, and this is one of the things that I think is painful for people to ask in the moment, but afterwards really drives value of the threat model, which is there stuff we don't know about this threat? Is this a threat because we don't know something? And sitting and being okay with that ambiguity is something that's really hard for us as humans to actually understand and do consistently. You've heard the talk of security champions. For those who aren't familiar with the concept, the idea of creating a program that enables a single person on a team to help scale threat modeling at an organization is key to being able to actually drive action items out of this. If you're trying to talk to C-suite or higher, or for those here who are VP, director, or C-suite or higher, take special note of this, because this is a challenge for everyone here on how to scale their organization. How do we actually make these things more useful? I can sit in a vacuum and make 250 threats for an application, but that's just based off of my knowledge. What do I not know? Can someone else fill that information in? And using that to understand and make decisions, and then turning around and taking those decisions and saying, let's educate on how and why we arrive there, why it's important to do it this way. Last but not least, what factors affect impact and severity of this threat? We all know the scary P word, prioritization. If you document why you are rating this thing you are rating at the level you're rating it, not just assigning it, but documenting the why, I guarantee you returning back to that why is going to drive either a lot of friction or a lot of value. Some whys are made because so-and-so told us to. Document that. If they told you to do it and that's why you're doing it, they should be fine with that being written down. And if you come back to, well, so-and-so told us to do it this way, and now it's too complicated for us to do it any other way, that's big. And you'll come to find that there's probably a lot of decisions that tie back to, well, we did it at the time and we ran out of time. So with that in mind, document your questions, document your assumptions, document your impact and severity, because when you return to your threat model, and if you remember point 3, you will return to your threat model, those things are going to be really valuable. All right. So with that in mind, I'm going to go ahead and use this time for a break. There is 10 minutes on the clock. Unfortunately, because I'm full screen, it's putting the poll anywhere. It is currently 10 past the hour. I'm going to give everyone 10 minutes to come back. I left the poll anywhere here where folks can ask me questions. I will go over these questions at the end. This will be the question that stays up and is activated for the whole rest of our session here. So feel free to return to it, refresh, and things like that. I will see you all at 20 past then. Thank you. All right. Gonna go ahead and get started here. If we could just get someone to run out real quick and let folks know we're reconvening, that'd be great. Hey, people, get back here. No, you're good, you're good. All right, one of the things I love about putting 10 minutes timers is I know the people who are here, they're in it to win it. And so I'm gonna make sure that y'all get the real value because I hit all the fun stuff at the end. We're gonna tackle these questions at the end. I'm gonna leave it up for presenting and things of that nature so that way you can continue to add to it. If I don't get back to it at this time, please feel free to follow up with me afterwards. I'll give you my contact information. All questions are good questions, and so I wanna make sure that you get your questions answered. All right, let me just make sure that that one is staying up. Okay. I'm putting this on the screen for a moment so that if you want to take a picture, please do. At its most fundamental, this little chart here is my guiding light for all of the teams that I work with. If you're wondering how you get started, take this. It's yours. It's free. It's for everyone. If you can explain the conversation to any person that you're talking about, hey, we're going to talk about a threat. I'm going to describe it. If the description doesn't make sense to you, tell me what I can do to make the description better. Hey, we have a mitigation, or do we have a mitigation? I'm going to fill it in here. You're going to tell me if it's accurate. If it's not, tell me what I can do to make it better. Action items and questions may potentially span the entire document that you have. Link out to a separate document, link out to other things. I find this framework works the best regardless of what skill level we're at. I'm saying this because I'm talking to advanced and intermediate folks who are here at this workshop. Because the most advanced thing you can do is get someone else excited about threat modeling. And I find that simplicity is the best way forward with that. Now let's talk about why you can actually use this to drive other things that are valuable to yourself and to your teams. One, questions and action items. That can drive an FAQ for your entire product. That's customer facing, that's sales, that's engineering. More teams can go through and execute based off of just your facts and questions for what your team is supposed to be doing. For your new engineers, your threat model, including an FAQ of why your threats are, prioritized the way they are, what your threats are, how you're mitigating them, that's onboarding documentation for your architects, for your engineers, for your testers. When you're talking to business owners, when you're talking to product leads about how are we going to make new features, how are we going to drive value for our customers, how are we going to make a difference in our space, that question can be answered collectively by everyone in the threat model because you're talking about why that threat impacts it. What happens if you mitigate that threat well? What wins come out of that? For our testers, for the QA folks, gives you the ability to say, hey, we have our stories for our unit tests, for our regression tests, for our CI/CD, for our detections, for our own pen testing teams as well too. Last but not least, by returning to your threat model in this really simple layout of documenting FAQs and action items, you actually get to prioritize your research and where you want to go next. You get to be able to say, hey, we want to experiment with this because it's an experimental threat we're dealing with, but we want to actually spend this time to drive some experimental work. And if we participate in an agile environment, we know that experimentation and innovation is core to those types of principles that we're talking about in a DevOps world. So let's talk about this a little bit more. I have a threat artifact. I got all 4 pieces that I need, all coming together. Now what? Well, we're going to talk about 3 different sections here. First one is creating tickets. Now, some developers love this topic. Some developers hate this topic. Some project managers love this topic. Some project managers hate this topic. I find that having stories, well-documented templates for how you take the output of your threat artifact and convert them to actual tangible work And taking out the guesswork for the people who are participating in this and templatizing it means that you go from talking about a threat to actually fixing the threat faster. And we'll take a look at 2 methodologies for this. Second thing is that I want you all to think about how you socialize your threat model results. This is really important, and it returns back to the very first question I asked, which is consider your audience. When you're socializing your results, who are you talking to? Your business, your sales, your testers, your legal and compliance departments, your privacy wings. Your audience is going to drive what you provide for them based off of the things that you're educating them on. And that's what we are, is educators at the end of the day. Last but not least, I encourage you all to return to your threat models and your threat model process often. Question it, poke holes in it. Much like we did a collaborative threat modeling exercise here, sit down with the other people who do threat modeling and poke holes in your own process and say, what are we doing with our process? What are we trying to do with our process in its current iteration? What do we want the next iteration of our threat modeling process to look like? And why is that important to us to do now rather than 3 months from now, 6 months from now, a year from now? The time that you spend on your threat models is invested. For those who are at principal, director, VP, C-suite, I'd like you all to consider this particular portion of the conversation. It's an investment in your time to update these processes, make them valid, useful, and actually go through and function the way that you expect it to. But your business changes. That's why we're small a, agile. And so you need to change with it. So let's talk about the changes. First, we were going to dive into tickets. These are 2 pretty common formats for how tickets can look. One of them is a 3-part user story. As a audience, I would like a mitigation and the description of the mitigation so that threat can't happen by the method. Can you see all 4 parts of your threat artifact reflected in the work that a developer is going to pick up? If I, as someone who wasn't part of the threat model exercise, picked up this unit of work, do I have an understanding of what my end output should be, what it can look like, and the types of questions I need to consider as I'm making the story? For those who have testing frameworks, some of the ones that use Gherkin, we have the feature, the scenario, the when, the and the then. How many people, especially from the testing space, would love to be able to see this come across their desk? They don't have to rethink the wheel. They have their test right there, and it's something functional that they can go through and verify and validate. I'm going to use a word here, and it's a word that I want to be super clear on. These stories should create demonstrable output. The idea that you can demo any one of these threat-driven stories should be the outcome. Now, this is not an exhaustive list. There's plenty of reasons why this can and can't work, and it's always going to be different from your organization. But try it. The next time you have a threat model, pick one, the biggest priority thing, and write a story out of it. I guarantee you, your PMs, your POs, your developers, your testers, your ops people are all going to be thankful because as part of these things we're already doing, like our agile sprints or ceremonies, those of that nature, we're already doing this. And like we said earlier, we've all been doing threat modeling in one way or another. We're just codifying it and saying it. The more time we spend on improving those 4 components of the threat artifacts, the less time you spend wondering what work you're actually trying to do. And I think for our developers, they would rather spend more time coding and less time trying to ask people what it is they should be doing. All right. So remember earlier when I said that threats need to be specific to your audience and that a diverse group of participants is really important? Here's some things to consider. These are different groups that we've talked about throughout this entire workshop. And with all of these different groups, they all get something different out of the threats. Developers get to say that by mitigating a threat, they've done work. They get paid. Things are good. Our QA team gets to define our test cases. And we have, more so than anything, a ubiquitous language between all of these groups who have problems actually talking to each other. in my threat models, my biggest threat is, and I hate to say this, the leadership team. There is no faster way to silo your information communication than by having a leader not understand why that information is important to pass out. By driving actionable work, by saying, this is a threat we're thinking of, this is the feature mitigation that it ended up being, this is how we came out of it. There's not really much to say that you don't see the value of, because you understand that at every point in the life cycle, it's been considered. It's not a security requirement, it's just a feature. And at that point, we're baking it into our processes and asking, why are we working on this the way we are? It's to benefit these other people who don't get a chance to live in the code every single day and have other jobs on top of this all. So, with that in mind, I have a little clip here, and we're just going to talk about it. This was my very first threat model.
Looks like the winds are changing.
Change is good.
Yeah, but it's not easy. I know what I have to do, but going back means I'll have to face my past. I've been running from it for so long. Ow! Jeez, what was that for?
It doesn't matter. It's in the past.
Yeah, but it still hurts.
Oh, yes, the past can hurt. But the way I see it, you can either run from it or learn from it. Ah, you see? So what are you going to do?
First, I'm gonna take your stick.
No, not a stick. Hey, where are you going?
I'm going back!
All right. I love Lion King. You will see them in all of my presentations. I'm sorry. That is a threat model. Rafiki and his stick is your threat actor. You got bopped once. You saw it once. You understand the threat a little bit. And you see just enough to realize you can react to it better the next time. And so what do? You take away the stick from the attacker. This is really simple, but this is threat modeling at its finest. And really, the crux that I want to get at is the next portion, which is not loading because it doesn't like me.
Yeah. Looks like the winds are changing.
Come on. There we go. And what are you going to do about it? Rafiki asked the fourth question. Rafiki is a threat modeler. He knows what's going on. And Simba is responding in the way that we wish every single developer would respond. I'm going to go back. Simba said it himself. I don't want to go back to the past. The past can hurt. Things change. This is all so confusing to me. I don't want to have to face the things I did in our past. But that's what a threat model is. It's a documentation of why we made the choices we made, so that way when we come from the future to look at our past, which is our current present, hi, I also play an Ant-Man and the Wasp, when we're looking at our past, we understand it better. The questions of why did this happen, why is it happening to me, why, are all documented. And so this is why I want to drive this point home. Your threat models is time invested. It has its own value, sure, but its investment value is really where it's driving what your company needs, what your service needs, what your product needs end to end. So you've got an artifact. Now what? You've got tickets and stories for your developers. Now what? I'm using this from the vein of the development team and as you being a champion on said team. You can use this to drive your onboarding. You can use this to prioritize your operational and security incidents. You can use this to inform your demos. You can use this to drive blog posts. And you can actually use this to improve your own system, your documentation, and your team velocity. Because if you just say that returning back to this point is the start of the next one, people will want to return back faster to the start so they can work on the next best thing. I want to touch on demos because this also came up in the overflow conversation. When we're in our sessions, when we're assessing an entire application or even a large feature set, it can be overwhelming to the participants to really understand where in the process they are and what they're trying to actually do. One of the pieces of advice that I gave earlier is to go through and create a demo. Create a way that that threat affects your application. Actually do it against your application in a controlled lower environment. Show it to other people. Don't just talk about it. And then take that and socialize it. If you have a demo that works well for your team, take it to another team and see if they respond well to it. If it's good for the development teams, take it to sales and see what they think about it. Go through and shop your feedback around to the different components of people that make up your team. And going back to the very first thing I did in all of this, consider your audience of what is it that your team values more so than anything. What about outside of your team? Well, this is a different group of people, a different list. One of the biggest things that I want you to understand is that new user documentation is the value add for your customer. If your customer can't go through and run the thing within the first hour or so, they're probably not going to buy the product. 10 to 1. It's just not a thing. By going through and saying the developer designed it to work this way, we have the tests to validate that it works this way, the sales engineer knows what they need to do to demonstrate that independent of the tests, now we know what our user value is from I have my product to it's working and providing me value. The other thing that I wanted to point out here is creating blog posts and going through and performing and speaking engagements just like this. I'm very fortunate to have a little bit of a background in public speaking. I know it's not for everyone. If you don't feel like you want to be up here on a stage with 100 people staring at you, which can be a little disconcerting, especially for 90 minutes, write a blog. Your company will love you for it. Your development team will love you for it. Your own personal brand benefits from you writing a blog on your lessons. So if you're going to do it for anyone, do it for yourself first, but then escalate those to other groups that may be interested, because you will be nicely surprised in every instance of who comes out of the woodwork to respond to your threat models. So with that in mind, quick review of the 3 things that I wanted you all to take out from this. First of all, threat modeling is for everyone. If you're new to threat modeling and you have no idea what you're doing, record your questions, record your assumptions. Just take over the documentation portion, watch and listen. I guarantee you it's how you're going to learn. I've had the wonderful, wonderful privilege of being able to work with Robert Hurlbut, who is next door teaching the intro to threat modeling. And I can say that the best way I learn at the foot of the masters is by documentation. And I know that it's something that as developers or those with technical backgrounds, we don't want to spend time doing. But if you're able to write the threat model and the threat and description and artifacts and you understand how it feeds into the work, then when you're actually doing the work, if you feel like that invested time makes your work more useful, that's value add in and of itself. And that goes as far as putting a small putting a small module on a front end, going through and finally feeling comfortable to get moved from development to operations. These types of things can inform you because we don't know what we don't know, and our threat model should be able to surface that. Next, threat artifact. You only need 4 things. One of them, it's okay if you don't know, but the 3 things, your description, your potential mitigations, which imply that you know whether or not it applies to your system, and the questions around why that threat is something that your team is going to deal with is the important part. How you got there doesn't matter in the slightest. Last but not least, and this is something that we talked about at the tail end here, go back and engage and re-engage with your threat model. Your threat model, the activities, those types of things, they're not the end. They should be the beginning. We talk about how threat modeling is meant to be used in a way that informs security requirements early in development. This applies to the middle of development, the end of development, after development's done and you're talking about your product. Return and re-engage is how you drive more value from it. It allows you to go to deeper depths on the topics, and it helps make sure that you're educating not just other people, but yourself to stay up to date and current. And as we said, we're addressing the idea that threat models fall out of date. If you're returning to it frequently, it won't fall out of date. Why and how do you return to it? Well, we covered all of that. So, with that in mind, here's my reflection questions for you. Feel free to write these down. Feel free to spend a couple of minutes thinking about them here. But these are the 3 that I really want you to think about for your organization. Feel free to follow up with me if you actually do answer any of these questions for your organization and want to talk about them. The first one is who. Who can I partner with outside of my direct team right now to share and socialize my application threat model? You don't need a why. It's just the why is I want more people to know. Whether it's useful to you or not, tell me. But the why should always be, Why should this matter and drive value in other areas? Next one. What's stopping from socializing your application threat model specifically, but your entire application, with your organization? If the answer is you don't have enough time to socialize what your product does, I guarantee you that you've made everyone else's job harder and take more time. And I don't think you want to do that. I don't want to do that. So how do you socialize what your application's doing, why the threats are what they are, and how you're handling them? Next, how can I close the loop between work identified and work completed? Templates is one of the easiest things that I gave you for creating ticket work. But really, at the end of the day, if your 4 components of the threat artifacts are detailed and descriptive, the work of actually translating it to tickets can be taken on by anyone, and that means the work of actually resolving those tickets can be done by anyone. So remember, if only 2 people understand the work, only 2 people can do the work, and you don't want to be in that position. Last but not least for reflection, what are some things you can do to improve the fidelity of your 4 portions of a threat artifact? This is going to be different for everyone. I actually have no other prescriptive guidance on this other than just take the time to think about it. You might find that what it is adding a 5th component to your artifact that is the explicit risk scoring, or a 6th one that is severity and that is needed to be documented because you're in a highly regulated environment. All those iterations, and the more frequently you return to your process, the better. All right. We have 2 more minutes on this slide so y'all can think, write, not listen to my voice. While y'all are thinking, taking notes, writing, those other things, I'm going to go through and do my shameless plug. If you're interested in finding out more, if you're interested in specifically Acquia's point of view of why we look at threat modeling the way we do and how we want to get involved, both in helping facilitate threat modeling engagements and helping build train the trainer programs, please reach out. This is something that myself and Robert are absolutely passionate about and would gladly talk about it on and off stage. So, with that in mind, there were some questions that were for me, and I have them here, but let's see if they end up showing up. All right, let me just pull up this response history. While these are coming up here, I'm going to just go through some of the questions that I've received here, and I'm just going to go in order here. It doesn't matter how you got there. What if how you got there means you missed a bunch of threats? This is a great question. I love this. Is threat modeling your only means of identifying threats? If the answer is yes to your application stack, there's a larger conversation here. One of the things that I would like to point out is threat modeling is just one tool in a tool belt that we all have to try and drive an understanding of threats. I heard a really great talk in the other room about going through and understanding your threats with it being supplemental to the tooling that you're using. I believe Edward was the one who was speaking about that, and that a tool is good at creating and understanding a large breadth of threats, but it doesn't necessarily mean that the depth of threats, specifically when they start being valuable to you and your value stream, are the ones that you should be prioritizing. They're the things that can't be found because they're unique to your business. So to that end, no threat model is ever going to be 100%. In the event that you have a 100% threat model, I would love to talk to you because you probably don't have a complete threat model. And that's just the nature of it. You will return back to this frequently because you will miss it. That's human nature. Supplementing your findings from the threat model with what you're finding from your tooling, what you're finding from your testing suites, what you're finding from your dependencies downstream and upstream, all should be part and components of what's informing your threat position. We're just talking about making the exercises themselves useful. All right, does security team ask for fixes only for critical and high threats? Thoughts on how to proceed with this with other threats identified? I'm responding to this one with what we started with previously, which is your threat model is not going to catch everything. However, your threat model should inform your conversations with your security team about why they're prioritizing the things that they're prioritizing and why you're prioritizing the things you're prioritizing. Okay, let me just see here. Some companies consider threat model data restricted need to know. Your suggestion implies sharing the threat artifacts widely to more teams, docs, implementation. How would you reconcile this with the widening audience and access to these artifacts with the principle of least privilege? This is a very good question and is dependent on your organization. And that's my favorite sentence to say and hear, but it really depends. I would challenge, though, that not all of your threats are confidential or sensitive. For example, if you have an existing mitigation in your application's 10 years old, the mitigation's never been triggered, no one's tested it, it doesn't exist, sharing, hey, can someone go test this? Helps. And if it doesn't work, then you have wonderful new data. When you're working through your threat models, you and your team should be able to identify, hey, what are the things that we want to share out? What are the things we don't want to share out because we have to go and implement that mitigation to a threat we didn't know up until 10 minutes ago? Balancing your information disclosure is always a juggling act, but I think threat modelers are some of the best at understanding how much information to disclose at any given time. So with that in mind, I would say talk through it. Having more people in the room helps. And if you're genuinely concerned about the information disclosure aspect of sharing parts of your threat model, talk to your legal and compliance team. You know, that one group that you probably left out of the threat models initially because you thought that maybe they were too far from the problem. They'll tell you the outputs. They'll tell you what the problems are. And then that can inform you on, hey, how do we go through and democratize our results? Let's see. Are you risk rating the threats in my table? For this presentation, no. I highly recommend that a risk rating of both impact, severity, and overall risk be included. However, I also recommend that as frequently as you're returning to the descriptions and mitigations, that's as frequently as you're returning to the criteria of why you made those threats important to your team. I saw your hand raised. Go ahead and ask. How often do you end up talking to that separate group about? Do they share the same prioritization method that you do?
We worked it out on how to understand what a high severity threat is and how that translates into how they're going to categorize it from a risk perspective.
Does your development team speak the same language? So I would say that your group may actually be more of a unique situation than just general guidance that I would give from the stage. So I'm just going to touch on this real lightly. If you're working with the teams frequently, the question was, what happens if you have your own risk function separate from the group that's doing threat modeling, and how does that play into it? Did I cover that right? The biggest conversation that I find that people have with risk is it's hard for developers to understand risk because they're developers. Folks who work in GRC, legal and compliance, these other areas have a lot of experience talking about risk. The toughest part has been creating a ubiquitous language that translates across that wall. It sounds like you don't have that challenge. So with that, if your team is able to communicate bidirectionally between those two functions, you've solved that problem for your team, for your application team. Not everyone has that boon. In fact, I would say that that's the biggest problem, is why should my developer who's deep in the back end listen when the compliance person is speaking? Well, because the compliance person is telling you that if you do happen to fall to 1, 2, or 3 parts of this attack chain, you are spending $5.5 million a minute. That is a quote from one of my application teams being down. $5.5 million a minute being down. I guarantee you there will be some learning curve around sharing the same ubiquitous language, but it won't happen again when numbers like that get thrown around. So to that end, get the two teams, whether it's risk and development, or development and compliance, or privacy, or whatever, get those teams in the room and just make sure you're talking the same language to start, and then return to that one often.
The only reason I asked for clarification on that is I never come from developers learning about how a large company deals with risk and how they think about it. So by creating a translation between the two teams, my developers can tell me when the severity is high because they know their application and they can say, if this breaks or if someone does this, it's a huge impact.
Mm-hmm.
Where the risk team, all they really need to know is they've identified this as a high impact, and therefore their risk is whatever the risk is rated on their side of the fence.
So that risk rating, though, is dependent on the veracity of the developers, and then in your system, ingesting the developer's output as downstream input for your risk group. It goes back to the activity we did at the very beginning. If your threat description is more accurate, it's described to the workload, if your mitigations are specific and actionable, if your questions are clearly aligned, then having those conversations, whether it's, hey, we just got hit by something we actually accepted the risk for, or we thought we mitigated this, you're already passing the largest hurdle, which is establishing that common language. Because what you end up finding is, rather than doing a reactive threat model to something going wrong and everyone being lost in the emotional response, because we're all humans, we all have emotions, there's the other half of it, which is saying we're all speaking the same language, we understand it a little bit better. I would argue that you did actually, whether or not your developers actually spent time, explicitly, you spent time to create a ubiquitous language for your developers first. And so that's why they can rely on it. That's why there's trust, is because they know it's being supported from another area. All right, we have 5 minutes to go and a couple of other questions. Are there any publicly available threat modeling repositories? None that I am aware of, but that being said, you can find some like generalized ones. If folks have other suggestions, I'd love to hear about them more. Sure, go ahead.
There is a repo with like loads and loads of threat models. I can have it on my bookmark somewhere.
Sure. I will share it out as part of this too. Do you have a suggestion for standardized, repeatable way to best prioritize threat remediation? Talk to me afterwards. That's a very, very long question and a set of services that we work through. Couldn't the questions and answers be captured as part of the threat model, not as questions and answers, but as part of the description of the system being threat modeled? Yes, you can do that. I would say that keeping your questions and answers stored in the same location, but still separate, is the important take there, specifically because having those questions be a part of still the finalized documentation of that threat gives whoever was not able to participate in that context the additional context moving through. And that's really the big thing, especially when we think about, oh my goodness, my lead developer got hit with a lottery and now is no longer working. How do I bring people up to speed with that depth of knowledge? You need to have the context, and sure, you can describe it in the threat, but what you'll quickly come to find is that threat becomes more and more specific to the role that's trying to describe it, and not specific, or not general enough so that everyone can pick up the work, because they lost the context of the questions being answered that drove that threat. Cool. And I'll hop over back to here. Oh, cool. Seems like they're updating in real time, too. Can you show us several of our completed threat models and how you would organize and drive data to conclusions? Sorry, customer NDAs stop me from that. How do you communicate the effect of a suggested countermeasure on the level of risk the threat represents? Demo it. If you want to see people respond to a threat, make your threat happen in your environment. I guarantee you, you'll have interested parties, and it won't just be a talking conversation. This can happen. It may already be happening. We want to prioritize it. All right, I want to take a look. Am I missing any other ones here? For hundreds of generators. Prioritization. I'm going to touch on this for my last 3 minutes here because I think there's something that we kind of lose track of, which is every company can and ideally should be using publicly published risk frameworks, but using that only as a starting point. Adapt the risk framework that you're working with to your organization. That exercise alone will teach everyone in the entire SDL more about their application and where it's being delivered than any single thing. It's all right to start with Stride and an empty table or Pasta or whatever it is, but in the vein of this entire workshop, how are we improving our threat modeling process? If you are using the same threat modeling process and tools and documentation for 5 years, I think that it's time to threat model your threat modeling process. All right. So how long does this threat refinement, I think that's probably how long should it take? And
Part 2 above that, I
Oh, okay.
on my phone. So
Okay,
I
cool.
finished it, my bad.
No worries.
How long does the threat refinement process take? And then for hundreds of generated threats from a tool where the prioritization is not already in place, and you may have people who have like varying expertise in the tool and trying to diagnose and prioritize those threats themselves. How would you convince them that refining and going through this kind of process with the threats is a good use of time when they're already looking at like 100 threats and countermeasures that have been generated by a tool?
Your development team should not receive a tool that hasn't gone through an internal tuning process. First and foremost, as a developer, the one thing I hate is noise. And we've heard a lot of noise. We've talked in another presentation that all tools generate noise. It's finding the right noise that matters. It's going to take multiple hours. But returning back to this concept, it's an investment. And as part of investing the time, you want to try and frame it in the sense of, by us identifying, resolving, and reflecting on this, sure, it took us 20 hours or whatever it is of engineering time, but that 20 hours of work financially translated to the amount of time for actually having information disclosure is probably about 3.5 seconds in terms of value. So if the value of 3.5 seconds stops millions and millions of dollars from leaving your company, spend as much time as you need tuning those tools because they drive your priority. And with that, I'm out of time. Thank you all so much for this. I really appreciate you all taking time. Please go stretch. I'll be available through the end of the conference, and then I'll be waiting outside as well too to field questions at the end. Thanks, y'all. Have a good one.